the spring of 1452, in a village embedded in the quiet terraced hills of Tuscany, a child entered the world that had not quite prepared a place for him. He was born between two worlds, the legitimate son of neither and the natural son of both. His father was Ser Piero da Vinci, a successful notary whose profession required precision, reliability, and social standing. His mother was Caterina, a young peasant woman whose full name has been partially absorbed by the fog of history. In an era when illegitimacy was not merely a personal inconvenience but a structural exclusion, the child named Leonardo entered life already marked by a fracture that the 15th century treated as permanent. He would not inherit his father's profession. He would not receive the classical education reserved for legitimate sons of educated men. He would not be able to join the guild of notaries or follow the path that his father's world had laid out. And in this exclusion, which must have felt at the time like deprivation, lay the conditions for everything he would eventually become. To understand what exclusion gave him, it is necessary to understand what inclusion would have demanded. A legitimate son of Ser Piero would have been channeled from early childhood toward the notarial profession, trained in Latin and formal rhetoric and legal procedure, his days structured by the requirements of other people's transactions, his mind moving along tracks that tradition had already laid down and social obligation required him to follow. The range of acceptable inquiry would have been defined in advance. The questions worth asking already identified by the curriculum. Leonardo was spared this, not gently and not generously, but by the simple mechanical fact of his legal status. And in that sparing, every door that had been closed by convention left every other door standing open. Because no authority had assigned him to a specific one, he spent his childhood outdoors, in the fields and along the streams of the Vinci countryside, in a relationship with the natural world that was not pastoral in any sentimental sense, but intensely and systematically investigative. He watched hawks from the hillsides, studying not the beauty of their flight, but its mechanics, the precise angle at which the wing held itself relative to the body during a sustained glide, the moment of weight transfer when a thermal column was found and the bird leaned into it, the relationship between the spread of the primary feathers and the rate of descent. He was not collecting impressions, he was identifying variables. And the distinction between those two activities is the distinction between a child who enjoys nature and a child who is teaching himself the foundations of aerodynamics before he has words for either concept. He watched water with the same quality of attention that he gave to birds, and what he observed in water would occupy him for the rest of his life. Streams moved around stones in patterns that repeated themselves at every scale. The small channel and the great river obeyed the same grammatical rules. Ripples interfered with each other and produced interference patterns governed by a logic that had nothing to do with chance. Reflections organized themselves according to principles he could not yet articulate, but could recognize as consistent and therefore learnable. He was developing, without any instruction in mathematics or physics, an intuition for the principle that natural phenomena at different scales are governed by the same underlying structures, a principle that formal science would not name and systematize for centuries. Because no schoolmaster directed his attention, he divided it according to his own interest, which meant he did not divide it at all. The flight of birds and the flow of water and the structure of a leaf and the behavior of shadows across a hillside were not separate subjects requiring separate mental spaces. They were expressions of the same question approached from different angles. And the question was the one that would drive him for 67 years. What are the rules by which this world operates? And why do those rules produce the specific kinds of beauty they produce? This refusal to experience knowledge as divided into disciplines was not a method he consciously chose. It was the cognitive architecture he had developed during the years when no one had told him which things were related to which other things. And that architecture, more than any specific discovery, was his most original contribution, his father recognized. Eventually, and with the practical intelligence of a notary, that the boy's drawings were not the enthusiastic scribbling of a talented child, but something more serious and more strange. The drawings were accurate in a way that exceeded training. They showed what Leonardo had actually seen, rather than what convention suggested a drawing of that thing should look like. And Sia Piero brought samples to Florence, to the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most respected craftsmen and artists in the city. Verrocchio looked at the drawings and accepted the boy as an apprentice. The child who had belonged to no world was about to enter the world that would sharpen his technical skill, though it would discover very quickly that it could not contain him. Verrocchio's workshop on the Via Ghibellina was not a place of contemplative silence. It was a working industrial space, dense with the overlapping activities of a successful Renaissance bottega. Apprentices ground pigments and prepared wooden panels and stretched canvases. The smell of linseed oil and heated metal was constant. Commissions arrived and were completed, and new ones arrived. Altarpieces and busts and decorative metalwork moved through production in overlapping stages. And somewhere in this organized, productive noise, a boy from Vinci was learning what art was made of at its most physical level. He swept floors, he prepared surfaces, he carried materials between stations, he watched everything. What distinguished him from the other apprentices, several of whom were genuinely talented, was not immediately legible as genius. It revealed itself gradually through a quality of attention that training alone could not explain. When he watched Verrocchio model a figure, he was not simply memorizing the technique. He was asking why the technique worked, what principle of light or proportion or anatomy it was encoding, and whether that principle had been fully utilized or whether there was a deeper application of it that the technique had not yet reached. This recursive questioning, the habit of treating every answer as the surface of a deeper question, was the cognitive signature of everything he would ever do, and it made him simultaneously the most attentive student in the workshop and the one least likely to stay permanently within its walls. The story of the angel in Verrocchio's baptism of Christ is well known, perhaps too well known to be received now with the attention it deserves. Verrocchio painted the central figures and the larger composition, and he assigned Leonardo to complete one of the flanking angels on the left side when the work was assembled and examined. That angel occupied a different order of reality from everything surrounding it. The figure had interiority, a quality that could not be fully explained by technical analysis. It was not simply that the brushwork was finer or the modeling more careful. It was that the face appeared to be the outer surface of an inner state. The expression seemed to emerge from a consciousness behind it, rather than being applied to a surface in front of it. Verrocchio's own figures, accomplished by any standard of the era, looked like representations of people beside something that looked like an actual person thinking actual thoughts. The legend claims that Verrocchio was so overwhelmed by what his student had produced that he vowed never to paint again, recognizing that he had been definitively surpassed. Whether this is literally true or whether it has been shaped by retrospective admiration, what it records is accurate. Something in the angel exceeded the framework that the workshop provided, and both the master and the apprentice knew it. For Leonardo, this was not a moment of triumph in the competitive sense. It was a clarification. Art was not a craft to be mastered and then practiced. It was an instrument of investigation, a method for discovering truths about the visible world that could not be reached by any other means. And this understanding would structure every decision he made for the rest of his career. Florence during these years was a city in the middle of a particular kind of intellectual excitement. The recovery of classical texts and the patronage networks of the Medici and the commercial energy of a republic that had made cultural achievement into a civic value had created an atmosphere in which ideas moved rapidly and reputations were built and challenged continuously. Leonardo absorbed all of it while remaining, in a fundamental sense, somewhat apart from it. He was not a humanist in the formal, scholarly sense. He had not been trained in Latin deeply enough to engage with classical texts on their own terms, and he did not trust inherited authority the way the humanist tradition required. What he trusted was what his eyes showed him, and he was increasingly convinced that this was more reliable than what any text said. This empirical orientation, this willingness to privilege direct observation over received wisdom, placed him intellectually ahead of most of his contemporaries in a way that was not yet legible as such. He began keeping notebooks during these years, and the notebooks revealed immediately and completely the structure of his mind. A drawing of a hand muscle appeared on the same page as a sketch for a mechanical device. An observation about the behavior of shadow in a landscape appeared beside a calculation about water velocity. Anatomical studies shared pages with architectural proposals and notes about the flight patterns of birds. These were not the notebooks of someone who moved between subjects as a dilettante moves between interests. They were the record of a mind for which all of these things were aspects of a single investigation. The investigation of the principles by which the visible world was organized. And the cross-domain connections he was drawing were not analogies in the literary sense, but structural recognitions. He was identifying the same mathematical relationships appearing in different physical contexts. And he was doing this 2 centuries before the scientific framework that would have given him the vocabulary to describe what he was seeing had been developed. By his early 30s, Leonardo had established himself within Florence's artistic community with a reputation that was both luminous and slightly unsatisfying. He was admired for his skill and discussed for his intelligence. But the specific shape of his ambition could not find adequate expression within the city's commercial patronage structure. Florence rewarded completion. Its entire patronage system was built around the relationship between payment and product, around the reasonable expectation that a commissioned painting would eventually be a finished painting rather than an endlessly deepening investigation into the nature of light and form and the mechanics of human expression. Leonardo's mind did not operate within this structure. It operated through what might be called hyper-optimization, a cognitive pattern in which no solution is ever declared final because every solution reveals a new layer of the problem it was designed to address. This was not unreliability. It was a form of intellectual integrity that Florence experienced as unreliability because it produced the same visible result. He had been observing Ludovico Sforza of Milan from a distance, understanding that this particular ruler represented a different kind of opportunity. Ludovico was building a court of genuine cultural ambition. He wanted to be taken seriously as a patron of significance. He wanted engineers and innovators as much as painters, and he had the resources to fund projects at a scale that Florentine commercial patronage could not approach. Leonardo wrote him a letter, and this letter deserves careful examination because it reveals a Leonardo who is often obscured by the romantic image of the solitary genius. It reveals the strategic intelligence. He did not open the letter with his paintings. He did not present himself primarily as an artist. He presented himself as a military engineer, and he listed 10 specific capabilities in precise and practical language. He offered designs for bridges that could be assembled and dismantled rapidly during a campaign. He described armored vehicles with sloped sides that could move through enemy formations while protecting their operators. He proposed methods for collapsing fortified walls through underground tunnels. He described cannon designs of unusual lightness combined with practical power. He outlined systems for redirecting rivers during a siege to cut off an enemy's water supply. He proposed methods for constructing fortifications resistant to bombardment. He described movable catapults of various configurations suited to different tactical situations. Only after 10 points of military engineering did he mention, almost as an incidental afterthought in the final lines, that he could also paint and sculpt with a quality equal to any man alive. The strategic intelligence behind this sequencing was precise and should not be underestimated. Leonardo understood that a ruler in the position Ludovico occupied, constantly managing the threat of military conflict while simultaneously trying to project cultural authority, valued survival and dominance more immediately than beauty. He understood that the frame through which he would be evaluated upon arrival at the Milanese court was not the frame of artistic excellence, but the frame of practical utility. And he constructed his self-presentation to enter through the frame that was currently open rather than insisting on a frame that was not. This was not dishonesty. Every claim in the letter was supported by notebook pages already filled with relevant designs and calculations. He was presenting genuine capabilities in the order most likely to secure the response he needed. Ludovico accepted, and Leonardo arrived in Milan in approximately 1482, beginning what would become a 17-year residence that was the most productive and in many ways the most psychologically complex period of his life. The Milanese court offered him scale and resources that Florence had never provided. Access to large workshops and significant quantities of materials and craftsmen, skilled in metalwork and carpentry and engineering, and a patron whose appetite for spectacle and innovation created space for projects of a size and ambition that was simply not available to him in the more cautious commercial atmosphere of Florence. He organized elaborate court festivals, designing theatrical machinery of concealed complexity that transformed grand halls into moving landscapes of mythological fantasy. He began hydraulic engineering projects for the city's canal system. He worked on military fortifications with the same analytical precision he brought to everything. And through all of this official activity, his private notebooks kept filling at a rate that suggests a mind finally working at something approaching its natural speed. Among all the projects Leonardo undertook during his Milan years, the commission for a colossal equestrian statue honoring Ludovico's father Francesco Sforza was the one that consumed him most completely and ended most painfully. And the story of that project is the story of the relationship between artistic ambition and political reality, told in its most compressed and brutal form. It was not simply a large sculpture that Leonardo was attempting. It was the largest bronze horse ever cast since the monuments of ancient Rome, a work intended to stand as a permanent declaration of Sforza power and Milanese cultural supremacy. He spent years on the preparatory work, and the nature of that preparation tells you more about his method than almost anything else in his career. He visited stables across Milan and the surrounding territories, spending extended time with individual horses, studying their bodies in motion and at rest with the systematic attention of a scientist. rather than the appreciative eye of an artist. He measured the distribution of weight across the 4 contact points with the ground, observing precisely how the angles of bone and tendon shifted as an animal moved from stillness through walk and trot, and canter to full gallop. He was mapping the physics of equine movement, understanding the system of tensions and compressions that made the visible grace of a horse in motion physically possible. He dissected dead animals to map the relationship between the external surface and the internal architecture, to understand how muscles inserted onto bone and what that insertion geometry implied about the direction and force of movement. He was not preparing to make a horse that looked correct in the way that a skilled artist looks at a reference and reproduces it accurately. He was preparing to make a horse that was correct, one in which every surface implied a correctly arranged internal structure, one that obeyed the same physical laws as the living animal it represented, captured at a single instant of maximum contained energy. The clay model he eventually completed stood nearly 8 meters high, and it was received by Milan as a marvel of the age. Visitors came specifically to see it. Artists traveled from other cities to study it. It was spoken of across northern Italy as a promise of something that had not existed since antiquity, and Leonardo had calculated the casting requirements with precision. 70 tons of bronze gathered in specific compositions for different parts of the figure. Then the borders moved, as they always moved in 15th century Italy. The French threat to Milan was no longer distant and theoretical. Ludovico's diplomatic position was deteriorating, and his military position required immediate investment. And the 70 tons of bronze that had been designated for the horse were redirected to the manufacture of cannons. The decision followed an irrefutable logic that Leonardo, of all people, should have been able to appreciate in the abstract. A cannon in 1494 could determine whether a city survived the following spring. A bronze horse could not. Ludovico was not an enemy of art. He was a ruler facing an existential military situation. And in that situation, the hierarchy of priorities organized itself automatically. Bronze became weapons, and the horse remained clay. When the French armies entered Milan in 1499 and Ludovico fled, soldiers discovered the clay model still standing exposed in a courtyard, and they used it for target practice. The figure that had absorbed years of the finest technical preparation and the most precise artistic intelligence in Italy was shot at by men who experienced it as a large stationary object in a conveniently open space. Its significance to Leonardo was entirely irrelevant to them. They were not making a statement about art or about Leonardo or about the relative value of beauty and military force. They were practicing, and the clay horse happened to be there. This indifference is in some ways harder to absorb than deliberate hostility would have been. Deliberate hostility at least acknowledges the existence of what it destroys. Indifference simply does not register it, and Leonardo would carry this particular knowledge. The knowledge of what indifference costs for the rest of his life. In the refectory of Santa Maria del Grazie, on a wall measuring nearly 9 meters wide and 4.5 meters high, Leonardo painted what would become one of the most analyzed images in the history of human culture. And he did it by refusing every convention that the subject had accumulated across centuries of previous treatment. The Last Supper was among the most frequently painted subjects in Christian art. It had a standard arrangement, a received vocabulary of gesture and symbolic positioning, a tradition of sacred calm that treated the participants as icons to be contemplated rather than human beings to be understood. Leonardo looked at all of this tradition and chose a different question entirely. He chose to paint the precise psychological instant after Christ announces that one of the 12 men sharing his meal will betray him. not the meal itself, not the aftermath, not the symbolic arrangement of sacred figures, but that exact second when the words have just arrived and 12 different nervous systems are responding according to their own particular emotional and moral architecture. Some men show pure shock, the open mouth and wide eye of someone who has received information they had no framework to anticipate. Some show a defensive denial that takes the form of protest. Some show the specific agitation of a man who suspects the statement might be about him and cannot afford to let that suspicion show. One figure, Judas, shows the particular stillness of a man who has already made his decision and is now simply waiting for the process he has set in motion to reach its conclusion. Each of the 12 responses is psychologically specific, not a generic emotion, but a particular human being's particular way of receiving devastating news. He arranged these 12 different psychological states into a composition of extraordinary structural intelligence. The apostles are grouped in threes, creating visual rhythm and allowing the eye to move through the painting without losing its way. Yet within each group, the individual emotions are allowed to erupt at full intensity. Christ sits at the exact center, calm and luminous, forming a triangular stillness that reads against the turmoil, surrounding it not as absence of feeling, but as a different quality of feeling. The acceptance of something that the others are still fighting against. The perspective lines of the painted room extend the architectural space of the actual refectory, pulling the viewer into the scene rather than presenting it as a framed spectacle. The whole composition operates as a precise machine for generating a specific psychological experience in whoever stands before it. To achieve the quality of expression he needed, Leonardo abandoned the traditional fresco technique entirely. Fresco required speed. The painter worked on fresh, wet plaster and had to commit each stroke before the surface dried because revision was impossible. This left no room for the kind of sustained observational refinement that was Leonardo's essential method. He developed instead an experimental approach, applying tempera and oil directly onto dry plaster, building up the surface through multiple sessions, allowing each layer to dry before adding the next, gaining the ability to return to a passage and deepen it days or weeks after first applying paint to it. This gave him control of a kind that fresco could not provide. It also introduced a fatal structural vulnerability. Paint applied to dry plaster does not bond the way fresco does, and the deterioration of the surface began almost before the work was complete. He walked the streets of Milan for months before beginning the faces. He needed not skilled models, but specific psychological configurations. He needed a face that carried the expression of a man who has chosen betrayal and has not yet been caught, which required the particular way that certainty about a decision suppresses the guilt that the decision generates, creating a stillness that superficially resembles innocence. He observed people in markets and taverns and along the canal paths, memorizing the small muscular arrangements around eyes and mouths that revealed interior states the people themselves were trying to conceal. He was conducting fieldwork in human psychology and translating his findings into paint with the same precision that he applied to anatomical drawings. When the work was unveiled, viewers standing in that refectory experienced something that the religious painting of previous centuries had not prepared them for. They experienced presence rather than representation. The sense of being in a room with something that was happening rather than something that had happened and been recorded in a fixed symbolic form. The psychological accuracy of the figures made them available for a kind of engagement that symbolic figures do not invite. Viewers found themselves reading the apostles as they would read people they knew, identifying the emotions, following the logic of the responses, becoming implicated in the drama they were witnessing. Centuries of deterioration and reconstruction have altered much of what Leonardo actually painted, but the architecture of the psychological arrangement, the structural logic of the composition, has survived all of it. The French army that ended Ludovico's reign also ended the 17 years of relative stability that had allowed Leonardo to work at something approaching his own scale and speed. He was 50 years old, displaced, carrying everything he had accumulated in notebooks and rolled drawings and instruments, moving through a landscape that military force had reorganized overnight. He traveled through Mantua, where Isabella d'Este, one of the most culturally sophisticated women of the Renaissance, insisted on sitting for a portrait. He made a drawing and did not complete the painting. He moved to Venice, where the Republic was anxious about Ottoman naval power and valued engineering intelligence. He proposed defensive systems involving movable underwater barriers. The proposals were considered and set aside. He returned to Florence briefly. And then in 1502 he made a choice that brought him into proximity with a man who represented something he had not encountered before in such concentrated form. Cesare Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI and the most effective military commander of his generation. He was also, even by the brutal standards of Italian Renaissance politics, extraordinarily cruel. He used calculated violence as an instrument of political control, eliminating rivals with a systematic precision that made the threat of elimination continuously present for everyone within his orbit. He was not cruel in the way that unstable or fearful men are cruel, as a release of tension or a compensation for weakness. He was cruel in the way that effective systems are efficient, as the most direct path between intention and result. Borgia hired Leonardo not as an artist, but as his military architect and general engineer, and Leonardo accepted. He traveled with Borgia's campaign through the conquered territories of central Italy, through the Romagna region that Borgia was in the process of subjugating, and his role was to inspect existing fortifications and redesign them according to more defensible principles, to map terrain in ways that could be used to control it, to identify the weak points in the geography of conquered cities that an occupying power needed to understand in order to maintain occupation. He was observing organized violence from the inside, and what he observed he treated with the same detached, systematic attention he brought to the mechanics of water or the structure of bone. He was watching force move through a social system the way he watched force move through physical systems, and he recognized that the same principles applied. The map he produced of the city of Imola during this period stands as one of the most extraordinary documents of the Renaissance, in a domain that is rarely associated with artistic genius. He measured the city systematically using a compass and a surveying instrument he may have designed himself, establishing a circular grid centered on the city's main square and calculating distances and angles with a precision that transformed cartographic practice. The result was an aerial view of the city so mathematically accurate that it resembles modern satellite imagery more than it resembles any other map produced in the 15th century. He had constructed in his mind the perspective of a creature that did not exist, something hovering directly above the city, looking straight down, and he had translated that impossible viewpoint into accurate measurement. Through a combination of geometric reasoning and careful ground-level survey, he eventually separated from Borgia's service, for reasons that history has not clearly recorded. Possibly because the specific character of what Borgia was doing became impossible to maintain distance from. Possibly because a political shift made the association less advantageous. Possibly because Leonardo simply recognized when it was time to leave a situation before it consumed him. He returned to Florence, carrying notebooks that contained not only military engineering documentation, but a deepened understanding of how power organized itself. How force moved through populations the way water moved through channels. How the geometry of control was as susceptible to rational analysis as the geometry of anything else. This knowledge would surface in everything he did afterward, visible in the political intelligence of how he positioned himself with subsequent patrons, and in the philosophical depth of how he began to think about the relationship between the individual mind and the forces that surrounded it. Florence in the early years of the 16th century was a city generating its own legend in real time. The Republic had replaced Medici rule, and civic pride was driving public investment in cultural projects that were explicitly intended to announce Florentine supremacy. The commission to paint monumental battle scenes on opposing walls of the Palazzo Vecchio's Great Council Hall was the most ambitious of these projects, and it was structured as a visible competition. 2 masters, 2 walls, and a city watching to determine which kind of excellence would establish itself as definitive. Leonardo da Vinci would paint the Battle of Ang, a cavalry engagement from Florence's own military history. Michelangelo, 23 years younger and at the absolute peak of his early productive intensity, would paint the Battle of Castina. The contrast between the 2 men was not merely stylistic, it was architectural. It went to the deepest level of how each mind processed the experience of making something. Michelangelo worked with decisive force. He committed to the single correct stroke and moved forward without reconsideration. His relationship with time was aggressive and forward-moving. He experienced delay as failure and completion as the natural destination of effort. Leonardo worked in spirals, returning repeatedly to what he had already done, finding the angle he had not yet fully explored, the layer of shadow that was marginally closer to the truth than the one beneath it. His relationship with time was recursive. Each pass through the material revealed new depths that the previous pass had only suggested. Neither of these cognitive architectures was superior to the other in any absolute sense, but they generated very different behaviors under the pressure of a public commission with civic expectations attached to it. Leonardo's preparatory drawings for the Anghiari were among the most extraordinary things he ever produced. He drew horses and men in the extremity of combat with an anatomical precision that had never been applied to this subject before. Every muscle was shown at the specific degree of contraction that maximum exertion required. Every joint was at the angle that the particular movement demanded. Mouths were open in the specific configuration of a scream produced by physical effort rather than emotional expression alone. Veins were visible beneath skin in the way they become visible when the body is working at the edge of its capacity. He was not illustrating battle in the conventional sense of representing its drama and heroism. He was diagnosing it, mapping what it actually does to the bodies of the people caught in it at the cellular level of muscle and bone and vascular pressure. The central group of the composition, men and horses struggling for possession of a military standard in a vortex of entangled limbs and weapons, was a compositional achievement that later artists would study for generations. It organized chaotic violence into a form that was simultaneously readable and overwhelming. The eye could follow individual figures through the tangle, while never losing the sense of the whole as a single, unified event. It was the product of the anatomical knowledge he had been accumulating for decades, applied to a subject that had never received that level of biological attention before. And it would have been magnificent on the wall if the wall had held it. Then the technique failed. He attempted to use an ancient Roman method involving heated braziers to accelerate the drying of an oil-based medium, and the heat did not distribute as his calculations had suggested it would. The upper portions of the composition began to melt, paint flowing down the plaster in long, slow streaks that destroyed months of work over the course of hours. He stood in the council hall and watched it happen, and the quality of his response to this catastrophe is as revealing as the catastrophe itself. He did not experience it as personal failure, but as experimental result. The method had not worked at this scale under these conditions. That was information. Precise and specific information about the limits of the approach he had tried. He was capable of receiving this information as data rather than verdict, which required a relationship to his own work that protected the investigation from the humiliation of the outcome. Michelangelo left for Rome before completing his own composition. The walls remained unfinished. The visual argument Florence had commissioned never reached its conclusion, but the copies that later artists made of the central Anghiari group circulated across Europe and shaped the compositional vocabulary of battle painting for 2 centuries. Peter Paul Rubens copied it in the 17th century with specific admiration. Raphael absorbed its compositional logic into his own work. The failure had generated influence by a mechanism that completed work does not always activate. The unfinished invites engagement in a way that the finished does not. It leaves space for the viewer to continue the work, and in that continuation the original keeps living. Around 1503, a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo commissioned a portrait of his wife, Lisa Gherardin, to mark the birth of their second son and the establishment of their new household. It was a completely standard domestic commission, the kind of work that defined the commercial middle tier of Florentine artistic production. A seated woman against a simple background, hands folded, expression pleasant. The whole thing to be completed in a few months and delivered to hang on a wall in a prosperous merchant's home. Leonardo accepted the commission and then spent 15 years not completing it. Not because he was negligent, but because he had immediately understood something about the subject that could not be resolved within the time frame a domestic commission required. He positioned Lisa Gherardin against a landscape that was not any specific, recognizable geography. It was the earth itself seen in geological time, in the long, slow time of rock being cut by water and mountains losing their edges to weathering and rivers, finding their paths through whatever the land offered them, winding roads worn into rock by centuries of use, bridges crossing rivers that had been shaping their channels since before any human memory of the landscape existed, distant peaks dissolving into atmospheric haze at the edges of visibility. This was not background in the decorative sense, it was context, the specific context of a single human consciousness situated within a physical world that preceded it by millions of years and would continue long after it. And the relationship between the figure and the landscape behind her was a philosophical statement about scale and time that the painting was making quietly and continuously to anyone willing to look at it long enough. The face was constructed through a technique that Leonardo had been developing across decades of observational work. He applied paint in glazes so thin that each individual coat was nearly transparent, allowing the layers beneath to show through and combine with the layer being added. He worked through dozens of such applications, allowing each to dry completely before adding the next, building up the surface through a process of accumulation rather than a single decisive application. The transitions between illuminated skin and shadow dissolved into each other the way they do in actual flesh, where no line separates light from dark because the gradient is continuous and infinite in its gradation. He called this technique sfumato, from the Italian word for smoke, and it produced surfaces that behaved differently from any previous painted surface. They seemed to exist in the same optical space as real objects rather than in the flattened space of representation. The expression was designed with a specific understanding of how human visual perception worked. Leonardo knew from his optical studies that peripheral vision and central vision processed information differently, that a detail seen from the corner of the eye appeared different from the same detail examined directly. He designed the mouth to exploit this difference. The shadow at the corners gathered in a way that the peripheral visual system interpreted as the beginning of a smile, while direct examination of the same area produced a more ambiguous reading, neither clearly smiling nor clearly not. The expression would not resolve into a single interpretation because it had been constructed to prevent resolution. It was a face designed to behave like a real face, generating different readings from different angles and under different conditions of attention. And this behavior was not a side effect of the technique, but the deliberate product of a theory about perception. He carried the painting from Florence to Milan, from Milan to Rome, from Rome across the Alps to France, returning to it across years and decades, adding layers, refining passages, finding in its surfaces the continuing evidence of things. He had not yet fully worked out about light and atmosphere and the psychology of observation. It never reached its commissioner. The merchant who had paid for a record of his wife received nothing. And while this constitutes professional failure by any reasonable commercial standard, it also reflects the reality of what the painting had become. It was not a commission any longer. It was the ongoing object through which Leonardo continued to work out his theories about how the mind reconstructs reality from incomplete sensory data, how perception is not a passive reception of the world but an active reconstruction of it, and how the most powerful images are those that make their own interpretation visible as a process rather than delivering it as a resolved fact. Throughout his career, working in rooms that were set apart from the official commissions that occupied his days, Leonardo conducted an investigation that was unauthorized by any institution and unsupported by any established tradition. He dissected human bodies. He did this over a period of approximately 30 years, working through more than 30 cadavers across his lifetime with the permission of hospital administrators who valued his contributions to medical knowledge, and in rooms heavy with tallow candles and the physical reality of decomposition, he produced the most accurate anatomical drawings that had ever been made by any human being. Drawings that would not be fully understood for centuries, and would not be surpassed in some domains for considerably longer than that. The context requires stating directly. Europe in the 15th century understood illness and physical suffering primarily within a theological framework. When a person fell sick, the dominant explanatory model was religious. The body as a vessel for a soul that was the real subject of divine attention, and the mechanisms of that body as secondary to its spiritual condition. Physicians of the era operated within this framework even when they were attempting to be practical. The Galenic medical tradition that still dominated European medicine was more than 1,000 years old and had been preserved and transmitted through channels that treated its authority as analogous to scriptural authority. To question it was not merely professional heresy, but something approaching genuine heresy. And yet, Leonardo looked at the body and saw something entirely different from what the tradition told him to see. He saw a machine of extraordinary sophistication operating according to principles as consistent and discoverable as the principles governing the flow of water or the movement of air. And he began the work of discovering those principles with the same systematic observational method he applied to everything else. His drawings of the heart alone constitute one of the most remarkable anticipations in the history of science. He identified the four chambers and described their functional relationships with accuracy that modern cardiologists have confirmed. He studied the aortic valve with sufficient precision to describe the way blood vortices form during cardiac relaxation and act to close the valve, a mechanism produced by fluid dynamics that was not formally described in medical literature until the 20th century, not by historical accident, but because the imaging technology needed to observe it did not exist until then. He was working 500 years ahead of the tools required to confirm what he was seeing. The anatomical work that most reveals the philosophical depth of his investigation is the work on the brain and nervous system. He was searching for what he called the senso comune, a term that translates roughly as common sense, but in his usage meant something far more specific and more extraordinary. He was searching for the point of integration where information, arriving through separate sensory channels, converged into unified experience, where the data from the eyes and the ears and the skin and the tongue was assembled into a single, coherent model of the world that felt not like a synthesis, but like direct reality. He was searching for the neural basis of consciousness, for the anatomical address where perception became self, for the mechanism by which a collection of sensory inputs was transformed into the experience of being a person in a world, rather than a body receiving signals. He did not find it because it does not exist as a single anatomical location. Consciousness is distributed across neural networks whose investigation required imaging technology that was centuries away. But the fact that he was asking this question in these terms, with this vocabulary of system integration, rather than the theological vocabulary that his era provided, means that he had arrived at the conceptual territory of neuroscience before neuroscience had a name or a method. He was not simply making better medical illustrations. He was proposing, through the specificity of his questions, a framework for understanding mind that located it in the physical organization of the brain rather than in the supernatural capacity of the soul. And this framework, however incompletely he could pursue it with 15th century tools, pointed toward the direction in which the investigation of consciousness would eventually have to go. These notebooks remained entirely private. They were not published, not circulated among physicians or philosophers, not incorporated into any tradition of medical or scientific knowledge that could build on them. A man dying of a cardiovascular condition while Leonardo was accurately mapping the mechanical failure of the heart valve that would kill him received no benefit from what Leonardo had discovered. This is not merely a historical curiosity or a romantic tragedy about the isolation of genius. It is a specific and precise demonstration of how fragile the transmission of knowledge is, how a mind can arrive centuries ahead of its time and still change nothing in its own era. If the mechanism for communicating what it has found is absent, Leonardo understood this about himself, or came to understand it, and it was part of the specific form his regret took at the end of his life. From the time he was a child watching hawks from the hillsides of Vinci, Leonardo was drawn to flight, not as myth and not as fantasy, but as a problem, a bounded and specific and in principle solvable engineering problem that happened to require more precise observation of natural mechanics than any previous thinker had committed to applying to it. He watched birds for decades with the quality of attention that other men of his era gave to scripture, and what he extracted from that watching was a theoretical framework for aerodynamics that was correct in its essential principles and would not be formally articulated by any other human being until the 19th century. He understood that a bird's wing was not a flat surface that pushed against air the way an oar pushes against water, It was a form that created differential conditions on its upper and lower surfaces as air moved over it. The curved upper surface caused air to travel a longer path and therefore move faster. The flatter, lower surface caused air to move more slowly. And this velocity difference generated a pressure difference that produced lift. He had identified the principle that formal aerodynamics would later call Bernoulli's theorem without the mathematics that Bernoulli would bring to it. Working from observation alone, he was also the first to understand that large birds spent most of their flight time in sustained glide, rather than continuous flapping, that they were harvesting energy from the structure of the air itself, using thermal columns and wind gradients as resources, rather than fighting against air as an obstacle. The framing of flight as collaboration rather than conquest is essential to understanding his approach. Most human thinking about flight before Leonardo, and a great deal of it afterward, framed the goal as overcoming gravity, asserting human will against a natural force that resisted it. This framing treats nature as adversary and technology as the instrument of domination. Leonardo's framing was different. He observed that birds did not overcome gravity. They worked within the total system of gravitational and atmospheric forces to find configurations in which lift exceeded weight. They were not fighting the medium they moved through, but finding in it patterns and pressures and currents that could be used. The energy that a hawk extracted from a rising thermal was solar energy that had heated the ground and set the air moving. The hawk was not producing this energy, it was finding it, learning to read the invisible structure of the atmosphere and positioning itself within that structure to take advantage of what was already there. Flight in this framing was not transcendence through resistance, but transcendence through understanding, through perceiving patterns invisible to less careful observers and learning to move within them. He designed flying machines across decades of notebook work. The most elaborate of these were ornithopters, with articulated wings powered by human muscle, through systems of levers and pulleys and cables, designed with close attention to the structural requirements of supporting a human body in the air. He considered the stresses on the wing frame during different phases of the stroke cycle, the mechanical advantage needed to translate the relatively modest force of human arm and leg, muscles into wing movements capable of generating lift. He also sketched a helical device, a rotating screw designed to compress air downward as it turned, which bears a clear conceptual relationship to the rotor principle that makes helicopters possible. And he designed a parachute, a pyramidal canopy of sealed linen that he calculated would slow a fall sufficiently to allow survival from any height. He went to the hills outside Florence, specifically to the slope of Monte Cesare near Fiesole, and wrote in his notebook that the great bird would take its first flight from that summit and fill the universe with wonder. There is fragmentary evidence, disputed among historians, that an actual test flight attempt was made, possibly by one of his assistants, and that it resulted in injury. Whether or not this specific event occurred as recorded, the underlying reality is clear and unavoidable. Human muscle is insufficient to power the wing area required for sustained flight. Leonardo knew this, or arrived at this knowledge through whatever testing he was able to conduct. And the knowledge did not defeat him in any simple sense. He did not abandon the investigation, he deepened it, shifting his focus toward the energy sources that birds actually used, the thermal currents and wind gradients that allowed large birds to travel hundreds of kilometers without flapping more than occasionally. And he continued filling notebooks with observations about these atmospheric structures because he understood that true observations retain their value regardless of whether the observer lives to see them applied. Engineering ran through Leonardo's life not as a separate activity from his art or his science, but as the practical dimension of the same underlying curiosity. If observation was the method and understanding was the goal, then engineering was the proof. The moment when understanding was tested against physical reality and either confirmed by working or refined by failing, he designed with the same systematic attention to the relationship between parts that he brought to painting and anatomy, and his machines, like his figures and his bodies, were organized around the principle that structure determines behavior, that the relationship between components defines the capacity of the whole. His military designs have attracted the most historical attention, in part because of their visual drama and in part because of the moral complexity they represent for someone whose entire intellectual project was organized around the value of understanding and creation. He designed an armored vehicle with sloped sides calculated from the geometry of projectile deflection, anticipating the conceptual logic of the tank by 400 years. He designed rapid-fire mechanisms that allowed multiple crossbow bolts to be loosed in rapid sequence. He designed a steam-powered cannon that encoded thermodynamic principles that were not formally described until the 18th century. He approached these as engineering problems in the same way he approached everything, with interest in the relationship between structure and function. And the product was a set of designs that later weapons engineers would recognize as structurally sophisticated, even by standards developed centuries after he drew them. The civil engineering visions are in some ways more revealing of his broader intellectual ambitions because they are systemic rather than instrumental. He proposed cities organized on two distinct levels, with pedestrian movement and commercial activity on the upper level, and the movement of goods and the management of waste and water on the lower level, with ventilation integrated into the architectural fabric rather than absent from it, with water supply and sewage conceived as part of the original design rather than added as afterthought to structures that had already been built. He was proposing, in the early 16th century, the conceptual framework of modern urban planning, the idea that a city is an organism with functional requirements that must be designed rather than simply accumulated, while European cities of his era were layering new construction onto ancient street patterns without any overarching systemic logic. He was imagining infrastructure as an integrated system whose components were designed in relation to each other. He designed a continuously variable transmission, a mechanical device for changing the gear ratio between an engine and its output without interrupting the transfer of power, which would not be practically implemented until the 20th century. He designed an automated bobbin winder for the textile industry. He designed a mechanical knight capable of articulated movement through a system of cables and pulleys. He designed a device for concentrating solar energy using parabolic mirrors. He designed a typesetting machine that anticipated needs the printing industry had not yet articulated for itself. None of these were built during his lifetime at full functional scale. The manufacturing precision required for most of them did not yet exist, and the materials needed for some of them would not be developed for centuries. What makes his engineering notebooks something more than historical curiosity is the quality of thought. They demonstrate rather than the objects they describe. He was not an inventor in the narrow sense of someone who builds things and tests them and modifies them in response to what he learns. He was a systems thinker who expressed his systems thinking through technical drawing. And what the drawings record is a mind that had correctly identified the structural relationships between the components of a solution before the manufacturing. Capacity to implement any of those components existed. Later, engineers who encountered his designs recognized in them not the guesswork of an imaginative amateur, but the correct understanding of the physics of a problem. a mind working at the level of principle rather than the level of available materials, designing for a future that required centuries to develop the tools to catch up to what the design required. In 1513, at the age of 60, Leonardo arrived in Rome at the invitation of Giuliano de' Medici, the brother of the newly elected Pope Leo X, and found himself in a city operating at a frequency he could not quite match, not because his intellectual powers had declined. They had not declined in any significant way, but because Rome in the early 16th century was a machine for producing specific kinds of visible achievement, at specific speeds, and the specific kind of invisible investigation that Leonardo had spent his life pursuing was not what the machine rewarded, or what its structure could accommodate. Raphael was painting the Vatican's great rooms with a combination of elegance and efficiency that made it look as if the work was simply happening through him, producing compositions of extraordinary quality on schedule and within the expectations of his patrons. Michelangelo had completed the Sistine Chapel ceiling 4 years earlier, an achievement so overwhelming in its scale and quality and sheer physical ambition that it had altered the standard against which all subsequent artistic achievement would be measured. Both men were working within the constraints of institutional patronage and producing results within those constraints at a rate the institution could comprehend and reward. Leonardo was doing something different. He was pursuing questions that did not have forms the patronage system recognized, the Pope's reported joke that Leonardo would never finish anything because he began by thinking about the end before he had started the work, was probably intended as affectionate exasperation rather than dismissal, but it captured with precision something true about the mismatch between Leonardo's cognitive architecture and the rhythm of institutional production. He was not slow because he lacked energy or motivation. He was slow because he refused to declare a problem solved when he could still perceive deeper layers within it. His completions were not the completion of tasks, but the exhaustion of his interest in a particular question. And his interest was rarely exhausted by the time a patron expected delivery. This was not a defect in his character. It was the inevitable consequence of a mind that experienced problems at greater depth than the people commissioning it could follow. He used the time in Rome the way he had always used time that was not fully structured by external demands. For the private investigation that was the actual core of his intellectual life. He studied the physics of the eye with renewed intensity, writing extensively about how visual perception worked at the level of mechanism, about the specific optical and neurological processes by which the mind reconstructed from incomplete and imperfect sensory data a version of reality that felt coherent and complete. He designed parabolic mirrors for concentrating solar heat and calculated their geometries with care. He studied the properties of sound and their relationship to the geometry of the spaces through which sound moved. He examined fossils in the hills surrounding Rome and thought carefully about what their presence in elevated geological strata implied about the history of the Earth, which was considerably older and more dynamic than any authority within those Vatican walls was in a position to publicly acknowledge. Rome clarified rather than broke him. It confirmed what he had been learning since Florence, that the rhythm of his investigation and the rhythm of institutional patronage were fundamentally incompatible, and that the incompatibility was not a failure on either side but a structural reality, about two different relationships to time and completion. He had never been competing with Raphael or Michelangelo in the sense that they were competing with each other. Within a system of visible production evaluated by visible criteria, he was pursuing something that had no competitive dimension because no one else was pursuing it in the same way or at the same depth. and eventually a young king in France would offer him something none of the Italian courts had been able to provide. A context in which this particular kind of mind was valued precisely as itself, rather than for what it could produce within a specific time frame. Francis I of France was 21 years old when he encountered Leonardo, and what he recognized in the older man was not primarily a master of painting or a designer of machines, but a quality of mind. A particular density and range of curiosity combined with a method of thinking that made conversation with Leonardo unlike conversation with anyone else the king had encountered. Francis wanted that quality present in his court, not to produce specific objects on a schedule, but because he understood, with the intuition of someone who was himself unusually intelligent. That proximity to a mind of this kind changed the intellectual atmosphere of everything around it. The questions it asked opened new chambers in the minds of people who were asked to think alongside it. And this was worth more to Francis than any number of finished paintings. He offered Leonardo the manor of Clos Luce, a comfortable house a few hundred meters from the royal chateau at Angbois, connected to the king's own residence by a private underground passage that symbolized not only proximity but a relationship of mutual access. Leonardo was free to come and go through the private passage, and Francis was free to use it in the other direction, which he apparently did regularly, arriving at Leonardo's workshop without ceremony to sit beside him and listen. The pension Francis offered was sufficient for Leonardo to live without anxiety about patronage for the first time in his adult life, and the only obligation was to be present, to think, and to share those thoughts with the king when the king came to hear them. Leonardo was 64 when he made the crossing of the Alps, his right hand weakened by what appears to have been a stroke that had damaged the motor pathways controlling fine movement. His capacity for the long, precise work of painting reduced, though not eliminated. He traveled with his small household. His devoted student and companion, Francesco Melzi, who had been with him since Milan and who would become the guardian of his intellectual legacy, and the difficult and beloved son, who had entered his life as a street child in Milan more than 30 years earlier and had remained in it, through decades of maddening behavior and genuine affection. And he brought 3 paintings: the Mona Lisa, the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, and the Saint John the Baptist. He did not bring them as saleable goods or as evidence of his professional achievements. He brought them because they were the objects through which he had most fully worked out what he was trying to understand. And they were not finished. Francis visited him constantly, and the conversations they had covered a range that reflected the full scope of Leonardo's investigations: the hydraulic dynamics of the Loire Valley, the structural logic of a proposed new royal city at Romorantin that would have canals and regulated waterways and integrated sanitation and streets organized on rational principles rather than accumulated historical accident. The relationship between atmospheric perspective and the chemistry of suspended moisture in air, the mechanics of cardiac function and the behavior of blood in the chambers of the heart, the geometry of light reflected from curved surfaces, the question of what fossils implied about the Earth's history. The king listened not to be polite, but because he found the conversations genuinely illuminating. And Leonardo found in this young man something he had rarely experienced across 64 years of navigating courts and workshops and patronage negotiations: the specific pleasure of being understood. He continued working in France with a sustained productivity that challenges the narrative of his final years as passive decline. He produced the mechanical lion, a device of concealed clockwork that walked forward across the floor under its own power and then opened its chest to reveal a cluster of lilies, the emblem of France, a demonstration that brought together engineering and theatrical intelligence, and the playful philosophical wit that had been present in him since childhood. He developed detailed plans for the Romarantine city project that represented the most sophisticated urban planning thinking of his era. He organized his notebooks with Melzi's assistance, sorting decades of accumulated observation into thematic groupings, aware that the document of his mind was the most important thing he was leaving behind, and that its survival required preparation rather than luck. Leonardo da Vinci died on the 2nd of May in 1519. At close, loose in the gentle landscape of the Loire Valley, with Francesco Melzi at his side, and according to a legend that has persisted across 5 centuries because it captures something essential about the relationship, with King Francis cradling his head in the final moments. Historians have debated the literal accuracy of this scene. But what matters more than the literal accuracy is what it records about the quality of recognition that Leonardo had finally found. A ruler who understood that a mind of this particular kind deserved to be held rather than simply present at its own conclusion. Leonardo had dictated his will in April with the same systematic precision he brought to everything. Melzi received the notebooks and instruments, the legal heir of the intellectual legacy. Salai received half the vineyard in Milan that Leonardo had owned for decades. A gesture of affection toward a man who had been difficult and beloved in equal measure across 30 years. 60 poor men were to carry torches at his funeral, a final act that combined a ceremonial grandeur he had always appreciated with a charity toward those who had nothing, that had always coexisted with his most solitary intellectual ambitions. He was reported to have expressed near the end the conviction that he had not done enough. That perfection had remained just beyond reach across a lifetime of reaching for it. This has often been interpreted as the poignant final humility of a great man acknowledging his limitations, and there is something true in that interpretation. But there is a more precise reading available that is both more accurate and more interesting. Leonardo's sense of incompletion was not the product of modest output. He had produced more original thought across more domains than any other mind of his century. The notebooks alone represent an intellectual achievement of staggering scope. His incompletion was the direct product of a specific cognitive experience that very few people in any era have had access to. The experience of perceiving totality. The more systems he unified, the more he understood how those unified systems related to systems beyond them. And the more he understood those larger relationships, the more visible became the full extent of what he had not yet touched. Perceiving totality generates infinity awareness, and infinity awareness generates humility, not as a performance of modesty or a rhetorical gesture toward conventional self-deprecation, but as an accurate response to what has been perceived. A mind that has genuinely understood the relationship between the flight of birds and the flow of rivers and the mechanics of the human heart and the behavior of light through different atmospheric conditions has also understood something very specific about the scale of what it has not yet reached. The regret Leonardo felt was not the regret of a man who had wasted his time or failed to apply himself. It was the regret of a man who had understood more clearly than almost any other how much time the whole project of understanding would actually require, and who had to accept that his own portion of that time was ending. The notebooks that Melzi carried back to Italy after Leonardo's death were not treated with the care that their contents deserved. After Melzi's own death in 1570, they passed through hands that did not understand what they held, were divided and sold and scattered across collections in Milan and Windsor and Paris and Madrid and elsewhere, separated from each other in ways that made it impossible for any single scholar to comprehend. the full system of thought they represented. Many of the ideas they contained were rediscovered independently by later thinkers who had no access to what Leonardo had already worked out. William Harvey formally described the circulation of the blood in 1628 in territory that Leonardo had partially mapped a century earlier. The Wright brothers achieved sustained, powered flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903 using principles that Leonardo had correctly identified through observation of birds in the hills of Tuscany 400 years before. It is important to say precisely what this means. Leonardo did not propose heliocentrism in the formal mathematical sense that Copernicus did. His observations about planetary motion were speculative rather than rigorously argued. His cardiac studies were astonishingly accurate, but did not constitute a complete theory of circulation in Harvey's sense. These should be understood as anticipations, the correct intuition of structural relationships that later thinkers would formalize and confirm. The distinction matters not to diminish him, but to describe accurately what he was doing, which was something different from, and in some ways more remarkable than, formal scientific precedents. He was a painter who completed fewer than 20 finished works across a career of more than 40 years. He was an engineer who built almost nothing. He was a scientist whose research remained unpublished and largely inaccessible during the centuries, when it might have altered the development of the disciplines he had touched. By the conventional metrics of any single field, his output appears slight, but the conventional metrics of any single field were never the appropriate frame for evaluating him. He was not working within a field, he was working at the place where all fields converge. The point where the question of how things work in general becomes identical to the question of how this specific thing works in particular. And at that place, the metrics of any individual discipline become inadequate measures of what is being done. What he left behind was not primarily a body of completed work, it was a method, a way of approaching the world that treated the boundaries between disciplines as administrative conveniences rather than descriptions of reality, that treated direct observation as more trustworthy than any accumulated authority, that treated every apparent answer as the surface entry point into a deeper question. He lived in a century when the dominant framework for understanding the world was theological, when the explanation for natural phenomena was whatever the established tradition said it was, when the idea that an individual's careful observation might overturn centuries of received wisdom was not merely unconventional but potentially dangerous. He did not challenge this framework loudly or politically. He worked around it, in his notebooks, in the private hours of his days, filling pages with what he actually saw rather than with what he had been told to see. That quiet, persistent, lifelong refusal to accept authority as a substitute for observation was the revolution he carried out. And it was a revolution that did not announce itself, did not produce immediate results. Scattered into notebooks that were separated and partially lost and gradually rediscovered across 3 centuries. But the pattern it encoded was real and recoverable. The pattern of a mind that had stopped asking what the world was supposed to be and started asking what it actually was. When that pattern was recovered and studied, it turned out to contain the foundations of fields that had not yet been named when it was laid down. Aerodynamics, neuroscience, urban planning, systems engineering, and most fundamentally, the scientific method itself, understood not as a formal protocol, but as a practice. The practice of disciplined observation applied without deference to inherited conclusion. Europe in Leonardo's era still treated illness as divine punishment while he was mapping the mechanical failures of the heart, valve that produced cardiovascular death. still believed that mountains had been placed in their current form while he was studying the fossils at their summits and understanding that those mountains had once been ocean floor, still organized the transmission of knowledge through authorities whose texts were treated as closed and final while he was filling notebook after notebook with open questions and revised conclusions and observations that contradicted what the authorities said. The contrast was not incidental. It was the defining context within which his work had meaning. He was not simply doing what everyone else was doing, but doing it better. He was doing something categorically different. He was proposing, through the practice of his daily life, that reality was accessible to careful human observation, and that such observation was more reliable than any chain of textual authority, no matter how ancient or prestigious. The child who had wandered the hills of Vinci, excluded from the formal structures of his society by an accident of birth that he had not chosen and could not change, had turned that exclusion into the deepest possible freedom, the freedom to look at everything without being told in advance what it meant. He had looked at birds and seen the foundations of aerodynamics. He had looked at water and seen fluid dynamics. He had looked at the human body and seen a machine of such sophistication that mapping it required 30 years of careful work and still felt incomplete. He had looked at a woman's face and seen a demonstration of how the mind reconstructed reality from incomplete perception. He had looked at the sky and seen an engineering problem waiting to be solved. He had looked at cities and seen organisms that could be designed rather than simply accumulated. He had looked at war and seen the geometry of force moving through social systems, according to the same principles that force followed in physical ones. And he had never stopped looking, had never decided that he had seen enough, or that the question in front of him was fully resolved. The notebooks he left behind were the map of a mind that refused to stop at surfaces, that moved through every subject it encountered toward the structural relationships beneath, that treated the universe as a single interconnected system in which the principles governing one domain were the same principles governing all. Others approached from different angles, and that understood this not as a poetic metaphor, but as a literal description of how reality was organized. The world he observed was not a collection of separate things obeying separate rules, but a single continuous process expressing the same underlying mathematics at every scale and in every domain. And he had spent 67 years trying to read that mathematics from the evidence available to his senses. And he had not finished, and he knew he had not finished. And he accepted this with the specific equanimity of someone who understood that the project was larger than any individual life, and that the contribution of any individual life was to move the investigation forward rather than to complete it. Leonardo was not unfinished. The world was.